Season 1985-86 was one of the strangest of the modern era, with Hearts, who had only been promoted to the Premier Division 3 seasons before and had finished in 7th place in season 1984-85, leading the table from the 21st of December until the final moments of the season. By this point, there had been no televised games for almost 3 months due to a dispute with the TV companies, and it would not return to the screens until March, contributing to the sense of unreality around Hearts' progress. Hearts had reached the top of the table partly because, with Scotland playing a World Cup playoff match in Australia on the 5th of December, clubs who had players involved were inactive for 2 weeks. It was widely expected that once Celtic, Aberdeen and Dundee United had completed their games in hand, Hearts would slip back down the table and normal service would be resumed. It didn't work out that way though, with none of them managing to put winning runs together on their return to action, while Hearts had already embarked on a long unbeaten run. An indication of how surprising Hearts' run was came on the day they defeated Celtic 1-0 at Celtic Park on the 12th of October. Celtic were top of the league, while Hearts had already lost 5 matches. It was a game totally dominated by Celtic, who failed to take any of several clear-cut chances they created, and Hearts took the points with a smash-and-grab goal by John Robertson. After the match, Hearts chairman Wallace Mercer said Celtic was the best team he had seen so far that season, and he hoped they would win the league. At the end of the month, Hearts were still in the bottom half of the table, but had crept above Rangers into 4th place by the 23rd of November. As the Scotland squad headed off to Australia, the only Premier Division match to take place on the 30th of November was Hearts v Clydebank, a 4-1 win catapulting them into 2nd place, just 1 point behind pace setters Aberdeen. The following weekend, Hearts visited Dens Park, with the only other Premier Division match being Rangers v Motherwell. Here was a chance for Hearts, almost incredibly, to go top of the league, but they could only draw on Tayside to draw level with Aberdeen, although they remained in 2nd place on goal difference, having played 2 games more than the Dons. They finally went top on the 21st of December with a 1-0 win over St Mirren at Love Street, while Aberdeen crashed to a 2-1 defeat at Tannadice. By the turn of the year, Hearts were on top on 28 points from 22 games, with Aberdeen, Dundee United and Celtic separated in that order only on goal difference on 24 points. Aberdeen had 2 games in hand, while United and Celtic both had 3. Celtic had started the season in fine form, conceding just 4 goals in their first 8 league matches and topping the table by a point over Aberdeen, who had played a game more. Then came the loss to Hearts, and after a 2-1 win at Motherwell the following week, the wheels came off with successive demoralising defeats to Dundee United 3-0 at Celtic Park, Aberdeen 4-1 at Pittodrie and Rangers 3-0 at Ibrox. Mark McGee was signed in the week leading up to the visit to Ibrox, and his double in the 2-0 win over Clydebank at Celtic Park on his home debut the following week did little to lift the gloom. Things began to look up a little with a comfortable 2-0 win over the now floundering Rangers on New Year's Day. But a sense of gloom seemed to envelop the fans after a crushing 4-2 defeat at Tannadice 3 days later left Celtic trailing 6 points behind Hearts. It didn't seem likely at the time, but this was the last league match they would lose in the campaign. Draws against Aberdeen, Hibernian and St Mirren saw Celtic fail to take advantage of drop points by Hearts, and by the time Hearts visited Celtic Park again on the 22nd of February, they were still 5 points behind, having played 2 games fewer. A win seemed vital for Celtic's championship hopes, and a huge crowd, with Hearts fans filling the entire East Terracing, watched an absorbing 1-1 draw on the day 17-year-old Derek White made a hugely promising debut at left-back. Celtic were in the middle of an injury crisis, with Pat Bonner, Paul McStay, Murdo McLeod and Peter Grant all missing, as well as long-term absentee Davy Provan and his understudy Owen Archdeacon. Mo Johnston put Celtic ahead on the half-hour mark, but Hearts showed great composure under pressure to level with a breakaway goal just before half-time. The league table on the evening of the 22nd of February looked anything but encouraging for a stuttering Celtic. Only Dundee United, 4 points behind but with 3 games in hand, looked as if they had a chance of catching Hearts, who were now only 8 games away from an astonishing title win. Celtic's season seemed to be over by the beginning of March, when they lost 4-3 to Hibernian in the Scottish Cup at Easter Road, having led 1-0 and 2-1. Both teams converted late penalties before Eddie May scored a last-minute winner for the home side. It was an infuriating loss, Celtic having already gone out of the League Cup at Easter Road, losing a penalty shootout after a 4-4 draw, followed a few days later by an easy 5-0 win in the league at the same venue. They conceded another 4 goals 2 weeks later in an unforgettable 4-4 draw at a rain-lashed Ibrox, Murdo McLeod saving a point with a late equaliser after they had led 3-1, Tommy Burns scoring the third early in the second half, despite Celtic having been reduced to 10 men by Willie McStay's ordering off before half-time. The defence was clearly a concern, and despite having conceded only 4 goals in their first 8 league matches, the game at Ibrox was the 5th time they had conceded 4 goals in a match that season. But incredibly, it was the last match Celtic failed to win, and they would concede only 2 more goals in their final 7 matches. Hearts, meanwhile, marched relentlessly on, and seemed to have taken a huge stride towards the title when they visited closest challengers Dundee United on the 12th of April, a week after they had beaten them in the semi-final of the Scottish Cup to reach their first final in 10 years. Hearts put on a masterful performance at Tannadice, with Henry Smith saving everything United threw at him to win 3-0 with a brilliant display of counter-attacking football. At close of play that day, Hearts were 5 points ahead of both Dundee United and Celtic, who each had only 1 game in hand. Hearts needed 4 points from their last 3 games. The title was theirs to throw away. The following week, Hearts hosted Aberdeen in what was the first ever Scottish League match shown live on television. The day before, Dundee United had dropped out of contention with a 1-1 draw at Clydebank, leaving Celtic, who beat Hibernian 2-0 with a powerhouse performance by Roy Aitken in midfield for the second half, the only team capable of catching them. A nervous Hearts almost dropped 2 crucial points after Peter Weir scored a penalty for Aberdeen on 73 minutes, but with time running out, John Colquhoun popped up with a late equaliser to put them on 48 points with 2 games to play, with Celtic on 44 with 3 games left. The next weekend, the penultimate of the league season, Hearts, now showing signs of frailty, edged to a 1-0 win over Clydebank, the last team to beat them way back in October. With Celtic beating Dundee 2-0 to remain 4 points behind with a game to come in midweek, Hearts now knew they needed only a draw against Dundee in their final match to clinch the championship. David Hay was quoted in the Glasgow Herald on the 28th of April, "If we score 5 goals without losing any in our last 2 games and Hearts lose to Dundee, we are there. But it needs a small miracle." A 2-0 win over Motherwell at Fir Park brought Celtic to within 2 points of Hearts, but it seemed to have left them with too much to do in the final match at Love Street. They would need a 3-goal win over St Mirren, and while they had now won 7 matches in a row, only in the first, a 5-0 win over Clydebank, had they scored more than 2. Celtic had hauled themselves to the final weekend of the season, still in contention for the title, but it seemed to be no more than a forlorn hope. All they could do was beat St Mirren by 3 goals and hope for the best. It was a typical West of Scotland spring day on Saturday the 3rd of May in Paisley, the rain cascading down onto fans exposed on the open terracing behind each goal at Love Street, while the more fortunate huddled in the covered enclosure across from the main stand as the teams lined up. All the first half action occurred in Paisley that afternoon as Celtic ripped St Mirren apart with a devastating display. Goals from Brian McClare, Mo Johnson with 2 and Paul McStay ensuring that their target was reached with something to spare by half-time. The third goal was a thing of beauty as Danny McGrain, Paul McStay and Roy Aitken swept the ball forward for McGrain, surging into the St Mirren half to feed Brian McClare, who ghosted past the defender to fire a low cross into the box where Johnston slammed it home. It was a goal fit to win any championship. Super Scoreboard on Radio Clyde and Radio Scotland's Sport Sound transmitted news back and forth from Love Street to Dens Park to fans listening on handheld radios and Walkmans, and the tension built for Hearts fans throughout the first 45 minutes as news seeped through of Celtic's growing lead. Yet still all Hearts had to do was hold their nerve. A draw would render irrelevant any number of Celtic goals in Paisley. As had been the case since they first hit top spot in December, Hearts had brought a huge army of fans with them to Dundee in anticipation of a first league title since 1960. Older fans cautioned against overconfidence. They remembered losing out to Kilmarnock on the final day on goal average 21 years before in 1965. This Hearts team had come from nowhere to stand on the verge of winning the title. But they were a team filled with quality, from 37-year-old Sandy Jardine and former Celt Roddy McDonald at the back, future Scotland international Gary Mackay in midfield, to a potent forward line of another former Celt John Colquhoun, John Robertson and human battering ram and former Rangers player Sandy Clark up front. A typical Hearts counter-attack that season would see the ball played quickly to Clark, who would release Colquhoun or Robertson on either side of him. Colquhoun had been a right winger at Celtic and had been sold to Hearts only that summer. He had been unable to displace Davy Provan, who had now been missing for most of the season with the illness that so sadly ended his playing career. Hearts had moved Colquhoun inside, where he had blossomed, and together with Robertson provided pace, guile and finishing ability to complement Clark's more industrial groundwork. This Hearts team were solid at the back and devastating on the counter-attack, so their lack of goals in the first half was not an undue concern for their fans or management, but nagging doubts were beginning to be felt. Almost inevitably, Celtic fans scanned the Dundee team sheet in search of the sympathies of their players, looking for any indication of how they would approach their day's work. Tosh McKinlay, who would later play for both Hearts and Celtic, was known to be a Celtic fan, and Jim Duffy had started his career at the club, while John Brown was known to be a Rangers fan. But perhaps the biggest Celtic fan of all was on the bench. With half an hour to play, Albert Kidd was introduced to the action, and suddenly Dundee became far more purposeful, especially when, in the final 10 minutes, news seeped through that Motherwell were winning at Ibrox. The news was actually wrong, as it often was in those days, where most fans would react to shouts from the odd supporters carrying a radio dotted amongst them, and by a process of Chinese whispers, it would emanate through the crowd. But this news raised Dundee's hopes of European football the following season. If they won, and Rangers didn't, they would take 5th spot and the last UEFA Cup place. With just 6 minutes remaining and Celtic 5-0 up at Love Street, Dundee redoubled their efforts and forced a corner on the right. As the ball sailed into the box, Rangers fanatic John Brown leapt high into the air to head the ball down for Celtic fanatic Albert Kidd to fire the ball home, sparking scenes of jubilation amongst the home fans, while the Hearts supporters sunk into the depths of despair. A few miles down the road, with the match petering out and St Mirren goalkeeper Jim Stewart holding the ball as he prepared to boot it downfield, there was no such confusion on the terracing as thousands of Celtic fans danced for joy. Players looked at each other questioningly, fully aware of what the roar meant, but also knowing that false alarms were common. From the dugout, physio Brian Scott half emerged, signalling 1-0 as a beaming Bobby Lennox sat alongside the impassive manager David Hay, who was clearly not in the mood for celebrating prematurely. On the south side of Glasgow, a roar erupted at Ibrox as news of Kidd's goal spread like wildfire amongst the fans, only to subside into nothingness as the realisation struck that it was Dundee's Albert who had scored and not Hearts captain Walter. Back in Dundee, Albert Kidd wasn't finished yet. Picking up the ball on the halfway line, he skipped away from a challenge and made his way menacingly from the right flank towards the penalty box. Looking up, he played a glorious 1-2 with Graham Harvey and rifled the return past Henry Smith. Grown men bedecked in maroon and white slumped to the ground disconsolately, tears flowing openly as the realisation struck that Hearts had fallen at the final hurdle. The roars intensified at Love Street as the realisation set in that the most unlikely of title dreams had become reality, and Celtic fans sang in the Love Street rain. The final few minutes passed in a blur, and at the final whistle, fans streamed onto the pitch in Paisley and Dundee. Celtic fans cavorting in jubilation as the players raced from the pitch, Hearts fans with an air of bewilderment and grief, wondering if what they had just seen had actually happened, or if it was only a bad dream. Any title win is a great occasion, but this one was special. Celtic had laboured through the middle part of the season, the defence collapsing and the forward line misfiring from October to March. There had been moments of optimism followed by moments of despair, with every step forward seemingly followed by 2 steps back as Hearts trundled ever onwards. But almost unnoticed, they had put together an impressive undefeated run of their own and had never given up, even when all seemed lost. If this day belonged to anyone, it was to David Hay. Still only a young manager, he had been thrown in at the deep end in the summer of 1983, tasked with picking up the pieces of a club shattered by the departures of Billy McNeill and Charlie Nicholas, but never anywhere near sufficiently backed by a penny-pinching board. 3 years into the job, of the 13 players stripped for action at Love Street, only 2, Maurice Johnston and Mark McGee, had been signed by Hay from other clubs. Despite 8 years having passed since the great man left the club, there were still 4 players in the starting 11, Pat Bonner, Danny McGrain, Roy Aitken and Tommy Burns, who had been signed by Jock Stein. 3 seasons had passed since Celtic's last title win, and Hay had struggled against a great Aberdeen side under Alex Ferguson and an almost as great Dundee United side under Jim McLean. He was under intolerable pressure after finishing second, well behind Aberdeen in the previous 2 seasons, and having finally overcome that formidable challenge from the North East, had faced a new threat from the unlikeliest of sources in Hearts. Hayes Celtic never played better than they did in the calendar year of 1986. But that summer, Rangers had brought in Graham Souness as player-manager and had broken the bank to sign a succession of England internationalists, embarking on a process of buying with borrowed money championship after championship for the next decade and a half. It was David Hayes' bad luck to come up against this, while the board continued to refuse him the transfer funds needed to combat the renewed threat from Celtic's then oldest rivals. All that lay in the future on the 3rd of May 1986, and David Hay was entitled to his moment of vindication and to take the greatest joy and satisfaction in orchestrating what was one of the greatest of great Celtic days.